Shutter speed. This week we are going to discuss shutter speed. What is shutter speed? So to define this, basically the shutter is a mechanism that precisely controls how long light passes through the lens is exposed to the sensor. So in your digital camera, it's really an electronic device. It's rather than a light sensitive piece of film. There is no mechanical shutter likely to control that light flow in a digital camera. So a shutter really is a valve. It's that valve that controls how long light flows through the lens and onto the image sensor. The smaller the aperture, remember the aperture is that opening, the longer it will take a given amount of light to flow through the funnel, and the longer the required exposure will be. So that makes sense. The smaller the hole, the longer it has to remain open for the amount of light to go through to get the proper exposure. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. And this can be a range. It really depends on the camera, and every camera is different. So the speeds on a DSLR range from potentially 30 seconds to 1/8,000th of a second. And that's really where we can stop time and see some unbelievable things. So when we look at how shutter speed relates to each other, when we look at the relevance of it, so 1/125th of a second is half as much exposure as 1/60th of a second. Okay, so if you think about that, a 60th of a second versus 125th of a second. A 1/125th of a second is twice as much exposure as 1/250th. You're looking at how fast and quickly that shutter is opening and shutting and how much light is getting through. So in a 40th of a second, you're going to probably see a little bit of motion blurring when the subjects are moving in your photo. If you bump that up to 1,000th of a second, or even higher, that does an excellent job of freezing, even if the objects are really fast moving. If your scene has really fast movement, if you're at 1,000th or higher, you're going to probably get some nice freeze action happening. A typical $100 point and shoot camera will be slower. Obviously, the cheaper the camera, the cheaper the tool, you don't have as fast of a shutter as you would with an expensive DSLR. That doesn't mean you can't do cool things. Okay, so don't think that you are completely limited by your tool. We're going to look at how we can play with your specific camera and get a really nice effects and understand how you can potentially control your shutter speed. There is something that happens, and this is called shutter lag time. And what happens is if you've got your camera set to a bunch of automatic settings, when you go to snap that photo, the camera is very quickly trying to calculate all of the settings, the combination to make that best picture possible. And that takes time. And so you might get a shutter lag time where there's a little bit of a stall or delay before that photo is actually snapped. And in some cases, that shutter lag will miss the opportunity then for a really great shot. So ways that we can overcome shutter lag, and for those that have lower end tools, lower end cameras, you may have to do this. So you hold the shutter release button halfway down and you compose the shot so the camera itself can prepare. Then once you get it composed and you're ready, then you're set to press that button the rest of the way down and get the shot that you want. There might still be some delay, but you're probably not going to notice it. Not comparable to just holding up your camera, clicking, there's a delay, you notice it, and you lost your shot. When we talk about shutter speed, we also can talk about something called reciprocity. And we're talking about looking at aperture along with shutter speed. So aperture and shutter speed work together, and they work together to create a proper exposure in whatever given lighting situation you have. So if you want to use a large aperture, if you want to use a wider aperture for a shorter amount of time because it's wide, so a lot more light is going to rush in, or be the same as smaller aperture but for a longer amount of time. So then they get equivalent amounts of light. So if you have a larger hole, obviously more light's coming through. You have to have it there for a shorter amount of time. If you have a smaller hole, less light's coming through, so you have to have that open for a longer amount of time. Hopefully that makes sense. So it's a give and take nature, the aperture and the shutter speed. And that relationship, as I mentioned, is called reciprocity. And it's one of the most effective exposure tools available to photographers. If the shutter speed is too slow, what happens? It's going to be really hard. It's not even probably feasible for you to hold that camera for the shot without some sort of trace of what we call camera shake being recorded. Now, some of you may have some vibration reduction lenses, and it's good to test what your camera's capability is with that lens. But I guarantee if you're running at really, really slow shutter speeds, you're going to get some of that camera shake. Even pressing the shutter moves the camera. So best results when you're dealing with slower shutter speeds is to use a tripod. Now, a lot of you will have cameras that you are not capable of adjusting the shutter speed. You don't have the fraction of a second capability for adjusting that shutter speed. Instead, you may have different modes. Now, some of you might have a shutter priority mode, and this is a semi-automatic mode. A lot of your DSLRs will have a shutter priority mode. And this is where you get to decide what shutter speed you want to shoot with, and then the camera chooses the correct aperture. So this is kind of nice if you're still kind of struggling with that relationship and how to get that proper exposure. So the shutter priority is ideal for situations where exposure time is more important than, say, depth of field. Because depth of field, remember, is determined by that aperture setting. So now in that shutter priority mode, you're setting the shutter speed and you're letting the camera choose the correct aperture. So your depth of field is going to depend on what the camera wants to set. Some of you have a sports mode or maybe even an action mode. It just depends on how your camera manufacturer has labeled that. This mode, sports mode or action, is really optimized for photographs that you want to freeze the action as best you can at, say, sporting events or any kind of fast-moving subjects. So it really, the functionality of all of these modes really depends on what your camera capabilities are. So the best word of advice is to understand how, number one, shutter and aperture work together, and experiment. A couple of great points here, and this is from a book. It's a quick read, Understanding Shutter Speed by Brian Peterson. His two main points here: you will always attain the fastest possible shutter speed at any given ISO when you use the largest possible lens opening. Point number two, you will be able to attain the slowest possible shutter speed at any given ISO by using the smallest possible lens opening. So what is it saying? When you have a large opening, when that aperture opens large, that's letting a lot of light in, you can have the ability to have the fastest shutter speed and still get proper exposure. Now, when that aperture gets small and you're very, very small lens opening, then we need to slow down that shutter speed so that we get the proper exposure. Okay? So understand that relationship. Now, how are you going to test this? You're going to have an exercise this week that you will be playing around with shutter speed, whether it's called shutter speed on your camera or it's in a different type of mode. But we're going to test your camera's capabilities, and that's what this week is about, is testing and experimenting. So composition is not your highest priority, even though you should think about it. You're going to be dealing with setting shutter speed and how you can control your shutter speed. So testing your camera's capability is all about exploring it and exploring what we're going to say high speed motion stopping. We're going to try to stop some motion. So it's going to take a little bit of probably creativity on your part along with your camera. Now here's the steps when you are trying to test your shutter speed and shoot some high speed motion stops. Put the camera on a tripod. Okay, this just helps for composition a bit, that you're not trying to run some action and trying to get your camera in the right spot. you want to try to find a decent background, whether that be dark or light. Some of those presentation boards that you can buy at a store work great for just a nice big white background. Put a black sheet or a black, felt velvet works really nice over top of something propped up behind your subject. And then you want to place, of course, that subject between your camera and the background. You might have to find additional light sources. I'm finding a lot of you are struggling, and it's because you have less than adequate lighting source. So try to, maybe just get a little lamp, or a crafting light works really great, or have someone hold a flashlight for you. And then, of course, experiment with the proper aperture setting, experiment with different shutter speeds. It's all about trying to figure out what your camera can do. Now here's a chart, and this is the equivalent exposures. And these are called exposure values, or EVs. Sometimes you'll see that listed. In fact, your camera might even have a setting that's labeled EV, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So this is really consistent. This chart is consistent for any particular ISO setting on your camera. So what we look at here are shutter speeds and f-stops, or the apertures. So a value of EV14, say your camera has that, might represent 1/250th of a second at an f8. So your digital camera might have EV values that you actually can set. It might also have like an EV plus or an EV minus dial. So look at your camera and see if you have that. And that lets you correct the automatic exposure by the amount you specify. Okay, so remember, aperture and shutter speed is equaling exposure. And so this is how we can play with our shutter speed also. So opening the lens aperture one stop, say to a smaller f-stop number, such as going from an f8 to an f5.6, doubles the amount of light that reaches the sensor. So if you look at the chart, if you go from an f8 to an f5.6, you're doubling the amount of light. That aperture is opening up. So when you close the aperture, go in the reverse direction, a smaller aperture, if you close it down, so say going from now 5.6 to 8, that halves the amount of light. So when you're dealing with your aperture, then along comes that shutter speed, so we can get the correct exposure. So choosing a shorter shutter speed, or a smaller shutter speed, quicker, from say a 250th to a 500th of a second, cuts the amount of light reaching the sensor in half also. So if you look at the chart, if you go from 250 to 500th of a second, you're basically cutting the amount of light reaching that sensor in half. Now, if you make the shutter speed be longer, from 500 to 250, so we're going the opposite direction, that then doubles the amount of light. So this chart shows kind of a relationship of when you go one way or the other and what happens. So cutting the exposure in half with either aperture or shutter speed, while doubling the exposure with the other controls, keeps the exposure exactly the same. So you can play with these exposure charts with the shutter speed and f-stop, because as the f-stop, that's the opening, gets smaller, shutter speed gets longer, or is a little bit slower. When the f-stop gets bigger, shutter speed gets faster. Okay? And so if you look at this chart, in theory, you would get the same exposure with them all, because the same amount of light is reaching the sensor. Okay? So here's just a couple examples. And sometimes you can sort of stop motion. Now this one, again, you've seen this photo that I've taken. And this was 250th of a second. 250th of a second. And you can see that I didn't exactly stop motion here. Because the bee coming in, even though I was playing with depth of field and that wasn't my primary area of focus, but you can see that its little wings, I'm showing some motion. There's some blurring happening there. So I did not stop the motion in this case. I need to have a much faster shutter speed to make that actually stop. And we talked about, 1,000 being the ideal number. This is at 250. Even if I went up, 500, you'd even start to see a difference. Okay. Now, if you look at this example, there's no motion here. But if you look at my aperture was at a 5.7, and my shutter was at 1/60th of a second. So it was pretty slow. A 60th of a second, you're taking a little bit longer, and it was to let more light in this given situation. So this information comes from two sources, two really great books: Real World Digital Photography by three authors, Eisman, Dugan, and Gray, and Mastering Digital Photography by David Bush. So those are two really great sources if you want to increase and further your knowledge in the world of digital photography.